we have Brandon Turner from Ohio State. Brandon is noted for his contributions to computational frameworks that help us go beyond what can be learned from behavioral or neural data and adds to our understanding of complex higher order cognitive abilities. I think he's also notable for being one of the few people I have known who have willingly traded life in coastal California for Ohio. So Brandon, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. I did indeed pick Ohio. I'm from the Midwest, and so it's just more comfortable for me. Too much sun, I guess you could say. All right, so despite the theme of the workshop being more about what does the mind think of the brain, this talk is a bit more methodological in the sense that I'm trying to develop statistical techniques for inferring what the mind is or what the mental computations are during a task from the brain, or multifaceted aspects of the brain, such as the decisions people make, EEG, fMRI, and so on. So the idea of trying to link brain and behaviors is very old, but in my mind, when I think about the people who have contributed to this, one really seminal article comes from Davida Teller, and that is about linking propositions, where she developed a set of axiomatic statements about what it takes for a physiological measurement to be related to a psychological construct. And then later, Jeff Shaw sort of moved this language more toward a probabilistic statements about how these two things might be related. And even more recently, Birte Forstmann and colleagues talked about imposing reciprocity. And what she means by that is trying to use theories about cognition in driving the data analytic approaches we use in neuroscience, as well as using neuroscientific data to help constrain theories about cognition. And so, in a more recent kind of review paper, my colleagues and I discussed another way of thinking about linking, and that's sort of treating it as a graphical model. And so you can kind of think of this orange node here in representing some sort of neuroscientific measurement. The blue node here just corresponding to some sort of behavioral choice. And then there are parameters that describe each of these processes. And then the whole problem of linking just comes to try and inferring what this type of structure might be. And so we found that if you organize it this way and kind of review the way that people tend to try and perform links between brain and behavior, you can organize them according to the goals that people are trying to accomplish. So one of them might be that you're trying to use neural data to constrain a behavioral model. Another might be to try and use the behavioral model to sort of affirm its place and mechanistically in the brain space. So you're trying to predict neural data in a very confirmatory approach. And then there's this other approach, which is trying to treat both aspects of the data as equally informative for the underlying mental computations that might exist. And so in this case, integrative is one example of that, like dynamic causal modeling, Carl Frisman's group, and so on. What I'm going to be talking about today, though, is about joint modeling. So this is a sort of hierarchical Bayesian approach to try and inferring the mental computations that create both the neural and behavioral data at once. So talking about a joint model, this is roughly how it would work. So you would kind of define a set of regions of interest. You would have associated with those regions of interest time series. So in this case, if we say that our neuroscientific data are bulb responses, we'd have a way of characterizing what the predictions are for the neural activation in those regions according to the stimulus. So they're systematically related. And there's going to be a set of parameters that are going to modulate this interaction, and we can infer those parameters from data. Now, in parallel, we would develop some sort of computational model on the other side of this, and it would be trying to explain how people come to the choices that they do, perhaps the response times and confidence and so on. And so if we assume things like a standard evidence accumulator model, we can talk more about this in the discussion, how people would eventually make their choices directly in line with the stimulus onsets that are shown above. Now, this process will be theoretical. It will also have a set of parameters that we can infer from the data. The final step is just kind of specifying how theta and delta might coexist. And so this, when used in conjunction, is known as the linking function. Now, this is an interesting part. So if you're familiar with Bayesian statistical models, the idea of hierarchy means that information that's in this stream, in other words, the neuroscientific measures, could actually help to constrain parameters over here. And similarly, the things that we learn about people's choices, their choice, the response time, and so on, can actually help lead the analysis of the neural data on the other side. Now, just for the purposes of this talk, I've sort of organized it in two different streams. So there's different ways of specifying this linking function. You can do it trial by trial or subject by subject. So I'll start with that. And then later I'll talk about how we've extended this more recently to describe moment by moment interactions of brain behavior dynamics. So it's been fairly well established that there are these very specific networks that contribute to choices. One very popular one is the default mode network. It's known that whenever this area is very active, people tend to be off task. When it's deactivated, people tend to be responding effectively or efficiently. Here's just one of my favorite examples. So this is just kind of showing the default mode network is reliably predictive of when people might be making errors at some point. So you can see this error here, and there's a pretty systematic relationship in the activation of that network and the choice. And so this seems very interesting. And so if you wanted to try and make a predictive model, you would ideally look for the default mode network and trying to make those predictions. Now, on the other side of things, if we look at the behavioral data, if you ever plot, let's say your response time, trial by trial like this, you might get something like this. And we'll notice these very interesting undulations in the RT data. And you might ask, what types of brain dynamics are contributing to this very systematic trend? Why is it decreasing or increasing in this particular location? The problem with this is that standard mathematical models that explain choice response time behavior, such as the diffusion decision model, I just sort of picked that here, they make this very specific assumption that the decision dynamics that happen on one trial happen on all the trials. It's known as independent identically distributed data. And so if you just kind of look at the RT data, we can see that that's probably not a very safe assumption, or at least it certainly leaves much to be desired here. So what we did in this study is just tried to combine a model of brain network activity to try and help predict choice and response time data. So here's our model that we have here. And if you're familiar with this model, I can elaborate in the discussion. There's a set of parameters that describe the drift rate and the bias, and these are going to fluctuate from one trial to next. And we're going to have a set of those for every single trial. And on the other side, we're going to have a set of neural data. And let's say we have a bunch of ROIs. Here, I'm just showing 8 of them. And then we have another set of parameters that are describing the systematic relationship and activation of these ROIs and the experimental design. So the last step here is just to kind of combine them. So we specify, how delta and theta should co-vary over all of the trials. And for this particular application, we're using a multivariate normal linking function. So what that means is we're going to have a mean characterization of the covariation of these two, and we will have a variance covariance matrix, which will help us to infer how different networks in the brain maybe give rise to these types of decision dynamics. And I just want to call attention to this very quickly. So whenever theta and delta are specified in this way, note that they have no relationship to time, but later in the talk, I will kind of expand this definition. So whenever you fit this model of data, there are a number of unique characterizations that come out of this, but just for the purposes of this talk, I'll return to the time series aspect of it. So if we can concatenate all of our time series data for log response time here, we can kind of see these interesting, fluctuations, just like I showed you before. If we were to fit a standard model, in other words, one that doesn't have any neural data, because it makes that IID assumption, it will just sort of predict one specific RT for all of these test trials, and it will look something like that. If we were to fit something that actually takes into account the neural data on each of these trials, we get something like that, this green line here. So you can see that there's some variation, some mispredictions, but in general, it's nicely following this general trend. I should mention, I should have probably said this at the beginning, this is cross-validated data, so these are out of sample predictions, and it's still tracking quite nicely. Okay, so just a quick mention about the linking function here. So I'm assuming that it's multivariate normal, but there are other ways that we've explored of sort of decomposing sigma. And it's a bit of a technical point, but there are ways that you can do this, using factor analytic strategies. So we have factor loading matrices, and this significantly reduces the dimensionality of the problem, making it far easier to actually estimate, increasing power and so on. The benefit of this is that we can characterize brain networks slightly better. So if you just use a standard multivariate normal, you get some sort of messy covariance matrix out like this. If you were to use some sort of factor analytics strategy, it does sparsify the network so you can better infer the relationships between local and global structure. And then more recently, we've also looked at regularization techniques on factor analytic strategies. So if you apply something like the lasso, this enables even more parsimonious network to come out without compromising fits of the data or out of sample predictive capabilities. So now we can move into the moment by moment approach. So in this approach, it was really inspired by some of the work by Max Schein, which hopefully we'll hear about later today. So in their approach, they sort of concatenate these different neural data and they aggregate over subjects from the Human Connectome project. And they're showing these different dynamics for these different tasks. And whenever you do principal component analysis on those types of measures, what you can see is that different principal components will help you kind of explain or correlate with the task block structure. So some of those components, are sort of corresponding to different, well, putatively, mechanisms that might be appropriate for that type of task. And so once you have that set up, what you can do is plot these different principal components in space. And there's no time reflected in this plot except for these arrows. So these arrows are kind of telling you that, whenever you're in this state over here, for example, you might be doing a motor task or social learning task or something like that. And as you move through this space, the idea is you're recruiting different types of networks to perform those tasks effectively. So we were really interested in doing this. We wanted to try and infer what these latent embedding spaces on the right might look like by characterizing the joint distribution of brain activation and behavioral dynamics. So what we landed on is using something that's called Gaussian process. And so this is a Gaussian process joint model. So the idea is that there's some latent structure in the middle, which is sort of informed by the experimental design as the particular of the stimulus structure. And then we're also trying to impose network structures such as, some of the DTI, DWI measurements that might inform how the specification looks like. And then once we have that latent process, the idea is that we can better explain how both EEG, fMRI, and behavioral dynamics might emerge as a function of this covariation that exists. So just to kind of show you how this works, similar to the Schein paper, we have these different latent dimensions that exist in the space, and these might correspond to different emotional states or fatigue states, for example. And the idea is that through time, you kind of have this habitual revisiting these different states. And as a result of these revisiting different states, you generate predictions for different types of data. So doing that same example again, if we were trying to predict something like behavioral data, which might be choices or response times or continuous monitoring type of task. And over here, this is just bold time series from one region of interest as an example. But as you're going through this different space, you can kind of see you're going to get different predictions for the joint distribution of behavioral and health data. And so we fit this model to data, and this is just showing ROI on one side, just one of those, and we had 34 ROIs, but just for illustration, this is what it looks like. Over here, this is a continuous monitoring task. So there's a bunch of random dots moving in a field, and they're stochastic in the sense that they are changing their direction over time. And we just had subjects indicate with a joystick to which direction the dots were moving. And so we have this continuous measurement coming through time, and we're trying to relate that to the actual bold time series. Now, what's really cool here is that all the fits look very nice, but part of this is that from these data and from these fits, what happens is we can actually look at latent neural dynamics. And so this is showing these three different latent dimensions. And this is through time. So as you go along this different path, as I was showing you before, these are different moments in time. And you can see that there are different states that are being visited through time. And this is supposed to tell us something, the topology of this is supposed to tell us something about the actual mental dynamics that are going on throughout the task. So we probed this a little bit. And so if you look into the different structure of this embedding space, you can sort of cluster it by functional coactivation. So this is just one analysis we did. If you cluster it in different segments here, you can explore the different types of coactivation matrices. So this is just the functional coactivation matrices of these 16 ROIs that we use. This is from cluster 3, which we use as a reference. This seemed to be the baseline that this one person was using. If we look at cluster 1 relative to cluster 3, we see significantly more functional coactivation. And if we looked at something like cluster 2, which are these yellow points, so in those points, whenever you existed on those points in the manifold, we get significantly less activation and almost something like inhibition. So you can see this is a negative coactivation with several ROIs. This is from the left frontal gyrus, this ROI C7 here, which is already been acknowledged as being something of an inhibitory process across the brain. So I'm about out of time. So, if we really believe that both neural and behavioral data are some sort of manifestation of an underlying mental process, in other words, a signature of the mind's computation, then it would make sense to try and combine all these measures to basically buttress our understanding of the mind's computations. But in my opinion, whenever it comes to trying inferring the mind, given that it's inherently unobservable, one way to approach this is to kind of use latent variable modeling. And building Bayesian hierarchical models that kind of integrate as many measurements of the mind's computations as possible. And so this is just one way of doing this in a way to kind of build a bigger theory of the brain. Okay, and so there are several my colleagues who have helped out on these various projects, as well as funding bodies and several very bright graduate students who are working with me. Thank you.
Unmute Susan.
Oh, there we go. Who said it the other day? It's not a Zoom meeting until somebody talks without being unmuted. But anyway, do we have somebody from, oh, I see. We do have a volunteer from the panel. Okay, Randy, over to you.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Brandon. I appreciate the talk and thank you for being here. It's actually a perfect opportunity to have a discussion about sort of your thoughts on how we link these two things that are underlying the brain connectivity conference this year. I guess one of my questions has to do with sort of projecting forward with the kind of work you're talking about now, where you sort of start adding to models as you acquire more examples of how they work in real data. So sort of instead of, this is going to sound more of a criticism than it should be, but often you see people doing an analysis for one data set and then do the next data set and forget about the previous one. So instead of sort of using, essentially using the priors from the previous data set to kind of update how the model behaves in the face of new data, they don't allow that sort of to be built. And that's sort of, at the heart of a lot of Bayesian inference, is that the Bayesian process allows you to actually use that knowledge from the previous model to really inform how the model evolves forward. And I'm wondering if you sort of thought about how to try and use your platform to integrate the different exemplars, if you will, to build the model of the brain and behavior, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think you're spot on, and the Bayesian machinery allows you to do this, right? It's sort of shared knowledge from yesterday informing today, and so this prior to posterior link. It just so happens that in almost all the studies that I see, no one ever actually implements that. So one step would be to try and do that. But another thing that these sort of hierarchical models gives you is this sense of hyperstructure. So as you learn about one subject, it informs this group structure. So we know that any given subject is going to be a random draw from that distribution if we make that assumption in the model. And so as we go from task to task, we would expect that any draw would come from that distribution, and we'd have to grow the complexity of that distribution. I think that that's fairly clear. I mean, just for example, the Max Schein paper, they show these different tasks. And so the brain, is going to change a different type of network dynamic for a different task. And so being able to characterize that position and the latent topology, I think is very critical. But the hope is that eventually, we'd figure out what that latent topology looks like by integrating from one subject and one task to the next.
Yeah, I wonder if you could, you mentioned factor analysis, and certainly there's a history in psychometrics of deriving sort of factor structures that get applied elsewhere. I don't want to invoke too many of those things because people have problems with like personality inventories and so on. But I think the idea is that if you define a latent structure that supposedly characterizes, in your particular case, the link between brain and behavior, you could envision using that also as a filter in some respects to see, as you go to the next data set, how well does the data fit that prior model. And again, using that ways as almost, again, as a prior to update to the next one and say, well, my latent structure is now changing slightly. And the reason it's changing is X, Y, and Z. And that sort of helps inform, how that link between brain and behavior, or mind and behavior, or mind and brain, if you will, actually works.
Yeah, no, that's a great suggestion. The one difficulty with using factor analytic strategies to solve that, though, is that you have to sort of know what the factors are a priori, and they do have, Bayesian unparametric analyses that allow you to, expand the factors as the complexity of the model grows. As you add more tasks, presumably you would need more factors. So that's one way of approaching that, but I know that fitting those models is quite difficult. So we have a real problem on our hands for that part.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Brandon. I see that Carl has his hand raised, but I'm actually going to turn first to one of our attendees, Shervin Safari. Will you come on and ask your question? Don't see you yet. Oh, here it comes. Okay, thanks, Shervin. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks. That was a great presentation. I wanted to ask you, if I understand correctly, very early in your pipeline of analysis, you have to pick a kernel for your GP for different modalities. For example, for EEG, one kernel, for the behavior data one, and BOLD also one. How you make these choices? If you can elaborate a bit about the process of picking or optimizing the kernel would be nice. Thanks.
Yeah, so maybe it's slightly better if I share my screen. I guess I had anticipated this question to some extent. So there's this diagram within this figure, it was in this paper, that talks a little bit about these different basis functions and the effects that things like kernels might have on this. And so there are these things. This is just one type of kernel, the radial basis function. And the idea is that if you change different settings within that function, you get different types of realizations of dynamics that you might observe. So as L, starts at 0.25, you get very high frequency types of things. As you increase L, then you get more flatline, like long-term effects, as you might. Now it sounds like you've sort of noticed in this paper that we use two different ones. So we might, we use a radial basis function kernel for BOLD time series. But whenever it comes to the behavior, we use what's called the Matern kernel. And so that was a bit of a practicality. So there's, we did try radial basis function, but that didn't work as well. So we tried a couple of different kernels, freely estimating L, fixing it, and so on. And at least for these data, that's what ended up coming up with. So, in terms of guidelines, I think that the kernel shouldn't matter so long as you could estimate these bandwidths, but it turned out that in practice, it did seem to matter. And so we're very much still exploring this. And so at this time, I don't really have good general purpose guidelines for that. I would just kind of recommend, specifying a couple of different basis functions, monitoring the fit, seeing which one performs well, and you'd have to cross-validate as well. So with generative models, typically people think, oh, I fit it to the data, and the time series matches very nicely, so my job's done. But really, I would emphasize that you would try and do out of sample predictions by splitting your data into folds, a half or something like that. And then you want to pick the kernel that not only fits the data well, but also performs well in the cross-validation. So sorry, I can't give you like a very specific guideline about how to pick the kernel right now. That we're still studying that problem.
Actually, it was quite informative. It seems that even RBM with different smoothness solve the problem quite a good. For Spark data, point process data, also you could use the same kind of kernel, or you had to move to something else if you have tried.
Yeah, we did try both. I don't have the fits for that. They're buried somewhere on an archive. But so we did try that, but I remember we ended up just picking a radial basis function for this case and the Matern for the behavioral. This had something to do with the distribution of the underlying measures. So when it came to the bold time series, the way that we had normalized those data, they had infinite support, so they were unbounded. But unfortunately, with the joystick task, there's a very real physical limit to the left, that you can respond, or the right. And then there's a centerpiece, but whenever you go far to the left, it turned out that radial basis function became very inappropriate because it assumes you have infinite support, whereas going all the way to the left is very much, that's the boundary. And so in that case, the Matern kernel did very well in that application. So I think that it will probably vary, depending on exactly what your task is, what the nature of your data are, and so on. But I think that this is sort of the gold standard. This is what typically the GP papers are using. So I would default to this, I guess, if that's helpful. But then if you have boundary constraints, you either try transforming them or changing the kernel slightly to build that constraint in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, Carl, please go ahead. Unmute.
Thank you. In fact, I wanted to ask exactly about that, about the issue that you were just talking about.
I knew that, Carl.
Before I do, though, just wanted to highlight, one key thing that you're bringing to the table here, which is a sort of low-dimensional, compact explanation for mind-brain that can explain both the behavioral consequences of a particular mindset and the physiological consequences. It strikes me that's conceptually nicely related to this notion of compression. To summarize in a generative model a low-dimensional manifold or embedding space that can generate all the things that we can observe. It speaks to Lisa's talk and the importance of this compression. So I thought it was a nice theme, which I'm sure we'll come across again. The second cheeky question is to Randy, before I ask my proper question of Brandon. Randy, is this millennial or 21st century partial least squares or not? So think about the answer. So to Brandon, so this Gaussian process modeling, that put simply, you're just trying to find some smooth functions of time that, after some linear or nonlinear transform, provide apt predictions of both the behavioral time series and the physiological time series. Is that basically a sort of layman's summary of the Gaussian process model?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, so we have some latent dynamics that we specified that's fully GP, and then the realizations like behavior and brain are just random realizations around that. So they have zero-centered function, but then there's some residual noise that we freely estimate for each ROI.
Sure. I couldn't quite tell from the graphics, but presumably you have sort of at least 3 or 4 of these functions sampled from a Gaussian process, and that defines the dimensionality of your embedding space or the manifolds that you were talking about. Is that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we didn't know how to exactly specify that. There are these papers that you can infer the number of dimensions on the fly, like you treat that as part of the GP process. And Giwan, the student that was leading this project, was working on that, but we were unable to really get that implemented within TensorFlow. So what we did, standard sort of technique is, you increase the number of latent dimensions, you fit them to data, and just kind of see, which is performing well in cross-validation sense, which is fitting the data, and then like which, from a parsimonious perspective is accounting for everything that we wanted to see.
And it is exactly that, because this sounds like a really exciting way to make the most use of data and also to test various hypotheses. And crucially, the biggest hypothesis you want to test is the brain or the mind, a one-dimensional, a two-dimensional, or a three-dimensional, or a four-dimensional. Does it live on a 1, 2, 3, or four-dimensional manifold? So in my world, that will be solved using Bayesian model comparison. I don't know how Randy would do it in partial least squares, but it'd be effectively, what's the right number of principal components or latent or singular vectors that you would use that provides the best account of data. But if you haven't got access to a variational inversion, then cross-validation would be the best way to ensure generalization that keeps simplicity in the game. But it's a devil of a job to evaluate the model evidence using any sampling or cross-validation scheme. So, my question to you is, are there any devices that you can use In fact, it sounds as though you've already looked at using the cross-validation accuracy as a proxy to the marginal likelihood or the model evidence to score models with 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 dimensional embedding spaces. But you couldn't get that to work, or could you? But you're just being modest.
Oh no, we did something like that, but it was very rough. So it's just sort of predicting and using a least squares metric. I think that there are definitely room to improve there, but that's effectively what we did, is a very discrete grid across the latent dimension space.
But well, can I just encourage you, if you're using the cross-validation, sorry, the issue here, of course, is to evaluate the model evidence is very difficult because you have to evaluate the accuracy and the complexity, and the complexity term is very difficult. But if you're using leave one out or k-fold cross-validation accuracy, you don't have to worry about the complexity. So your cross-validation accuracy, the log likelihood, is a really good proxy for the model evidence. So you should be able to use that to get a nice inverted U on the number of dimensions using a grid or a line search. And you should feel licensed to use that as the most appropriate measure of the goodness of this dimensionality for explaining these data. Because you're using the cross-validation accuracy, that is perfectly okay.
Okay, I guess I was being a bit more conservative about that. I thought, complexity is only relative to the task. So if we change the task and this sort of manifold doesn't really hold, then I don't know. I just felt like cross-validation alone wouldn't be sufficient for my purposes. I didn't know what else to use.
No, it would. It's the complexity here is really the complexity of your generative model and explaining the data for this particular task. It's not a comment about the task. It's just, how many dimensions do I need to explain this particular behavioral, physiological manifestation or outcomes of the brain doing this task. So I would certainly encourage you to sell the cross-validation accuracy as a pragmatic and practical way of scoring the goodness of your generative models in terms of the dimensionality. Anyway, I'm waiting to hear what Randy's answer is.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote this like it could be a version of PLS, but it doesn't have enough angst built into it. So, but I will say, however, Carl, that that your suggestion about cross-validation, I think, is an excellent one. I've been doing some work actually looking at PLS and canonical correlation in a cross-validation framework and finding that it's probably the best way to assess how robust your model is and transferable. So all the other metrics that one uses are nice, but the cross-validation one seems to be a much better way to go. The only problem, of course, is making sure you have enough data to do an adequate number of resamplings. But I think it's a much better strategy going forward.
Carl, just to follow up on, I mean, just what do you do whenever you're trying to cross-validate both brain and behavior, and how do you weight misses on the brain side or the behavioral side, and do you have any suggestions there?
Well, I think I was assuming that your manifolds are jointly predicting both kinds of time series, so that doesn't become an issue. And so just committing to the thesis you're putting on the table, you're trying to find one explanation for these different two kinds of data. So you could either do that in parallel, as you described in your talk, or you could use Bayesian belief updating of the sort that Randy was talking about. You just take you take the posterior or whatever approximation you can get hold of, having fitted the say behavioral data, and then you put that as a prior using the same generative model that is implicit in having the link function for the physiological data. So you shouldn't have that problem.
Okay.
I repeat, if you think this is not an easy problem to solve, I would encourage you to revisit that, and it may well be that you've actually already solved it. You just didn't know that you've solved it.
Okay, well, I doubt that, but thanks for the vote of confidence.
Well, thank you, Carl. It's not often that people get to not know that they've solved the problem that they've solved. So this may make Brandon's life a little bit easier. But we're next going to turn to one of our attendees who has a question, Stefano Proskas. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, Proskas. Ah, there you are. Please unmute.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting, and I particularly like the slide where you showed the input of stimulus and and the structural connectivity, and then as latent factors, then giving information about EEG, fMRI, and also behavior. And it kind of reminded me of what Danny Bassett talked about yesterday about network control theory, and how structural connectivity and the introduction of stimuli constrains what we see in functional connectivity dynamics. And I was wondering if what you have presented here today, if it could be expressed as a form of controllability.
I mean, that would definitely be nice. We have worked in pretty extensively on trying to use structural data to inform what the functional coactivation matrices will be. And we, well, just to expand on that, I mean, we tried this Chinese restaurant process idea. So it's this Bayesian unparametrics to infer what the complexity of the links are from structural data, to basically impose a really strict prior on the factor analytic reduction that I was showing earlier. But we unfortunately were not able to get that. It seems that the structural data is actually not that predictive of the functional data, at least in the tasks that we were using, at least at this really strong group level structure. So what I mean is that we can only fit the structural data, the CRP process of structural data at the group level because it's just, there's a technical issue, but these matrices become invertible or non-invertible for individual subjects. But then whenever you're trying to predict the functional connectivity, it turns out that there's a lot of heterogeneity in individual functional connectivity results. And so the group structure is not, helping us predict the individual. So we're a bit stuck on this problem, but I do think it's a great goal to have. And perhaps, once I read some of Danny's papers a little more carefully, this might be a great solution to the problem.
Great, thank you very much. I just wanted to mention to our attendees and participants that if you're in a position where you would like to ask a question, but you don't have access to a mic or you don't feel that you can unmute, please just go ahead and indicate that in your question, and we can either read your question out, or what we're having is sometimes another participant will volunteer to ask that question for you. So, we are a community, so there's lots of ways that we can handle things, and we don't want anyone to feel that they can't participate because they may not be able to. They may be in a situation where unmuting or having their mic on is not possible. So speaking of good citizen, we're going to go to Dan Laurie, who's going to ask a question. Go ahead, Dan.
Sure. So this is a question asked by Colin Hawthorne. I think this is a really great one, which is kind of about the extent to which these models kind of embrace idiographic and individual differences. So yeah, so as you go through these models and build latent brain behavior links, are you assuming similar structures of brain behavioral relationships across participants? Some aspects of task evoked activity can be very different between participants. For example, some participants will evoke overall greater magnitudes of activation or deactivation across tasks. Does your approach capture this aspect of their brain variability and activity, and how it may differ across individuals, and thus affect the relationship between brains and behavior?
Yeah, that's a great question. So far, in theory it could. That's a short answer. But practically speaking, we haven't really been doing that. We've been on one of two sides of this. So either fitting the model only to individual data and excluding everything else. So that's like the extreme side of individual differences. And the other side is sort of throwing them together and assuming a hierarchy across trials, but the subjects have some sort of shared covariation. And so that one, it's aggregating across people, and it kind of loses this individual differences aspect, but it does kind of increase the power of the problem. So the ideal solution is somewhere between those two. So you have every individual having a unique brain behavior link, and you just kind of assume that brain behavior link, like the topology, for example, as being a random realization from a group level structure. But the problem is whenever you're doing moment by moment, subject by subject, and then across groups, there's 3 different levels of a hierarchy to fit. And as you can imagine, that's non-trivial. It definitely is quite expensive to try and fit the data. While even code up is also quite difficult. So there's some difficulty there. And so even though I appreciate individual differences as much as the next person, trying to get that in a fully hierarchical Bayesian analysis where we actually get the power of the group informing individual variation that's been very difficult to set up so far. So the topology stuff that I showed in the second part of the talk, that was fit to each individual specifically, right? And so we didn't allow any crosstalk in the manifolds.
Thank you, Brandon. And I'm sure that Emily will have a little bit to say about studies of individual differences in her next talk. So she's getting perfectly queued up here.
Right.
So we heard that Colin actually does now have a microphone. And so I just want to give Colin the opportunity to add in or say anything or follow up if he would like to. Go ahead, Colin.
Thanks. I mean, I'm not surprised that this is a very complicated issue to model in any given way, right? Because you are now talking about a 3 or a higher level model. And of course, the most common approach that we all use is to collapse across participants. From my perspective, it looks like the biggest source of variability when you're thinking about task fMRIs is actually a fairly global difference across general magnitudes across a lot of task relevant networks, which I think can drive a lot of differences between individuals. And maybe there's a way to account for that or somehow even almost remove that variability across participants and think about how that maps onto or modifies the brain behavior relationships in the latent space. But anyway, I'll certainly agree it's a non-trivial problem that a lot of us are banging our heads against that wall. I do love the latent space approach in general, and I think it's been very powerful for a lot of work, and particularly, driving that inspiration from Mac's work, which is just fantastic. So, great stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. I think it is a great question. I just wish I knew how to build in that extra layer of complexity without causing too much shrinkage. And it's not really clear to me which
Actually, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
One possibility might be to consider doing some sort of clustering algorithm to your participants based on their general task activation patterns prior to your models, and then separating out into subgroups based on different sort of activation patterns.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
I don't really believe that people fall into distinct clusters, but there's kind of spectrums, I think, under there. But the clustering can give you a way to kind of pull out parts of the spectrum. Again, though, a little offside and a bit complicated. And it'd be interesting to see, though, if the latent space models would be similar across participants that have potentially quite different overall patterns of brain activation across similar task space.
Yeah, we did roughly try that, but we failed. So maybe we should return to this. The issue was that the latent topology piece is not really known until you fit the individuals. So we tried fitting them all separately, and then we tried to sort of do some cluster, but there's no constraint on what that topology looks like. It can be twisted and bent and warped and whatever. So we have to try something to kind of allow for rotations, and these topologies are.
My first thought is a relatively simplistic one, to take some sort of take each person's sort of total task activation map and split based on that. So if you're doing a task fMRI, like if you're doing an MBAC task, for example, just randomly, cluster based on individual MBAC task activation and split people up that way based on their total pattern, and then I might be a little off base of how that would actually work, but that would be my first thought, but I'm biased because that's kind of what I've done. So anyway.
Okay. Yeah, I think these are great ideas.
Great, thanks. Okay, next I'm going to turn to Mike Halassa, who has a question. Go ahead, Mike.
Hi. Thanks for a great talk. I'm just wondering, how do you approach a problem where you are interested in a macroscopic phenomenon like a behavior, right? And you can decompose it into some latent variables. How do you approach trying to figure out what the microscopic details of those latent variables are?
Well, so when you mean microscopic, do you mean like individual processing steps, like in a computational model? Like,
yeah, I mean, not only that, yes, the computational microscopic details, but also neurally, how these things get implemented.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of approaches. I mean, the one that comes to mind comes from John Anderson's work. So he does these hidden semi-Markov models. So he basically says that there may be some, state at which people go through in the full processing of a different task. And he uses those individual states to kind of relate, brain data like, EEG or fMRI in this case. And then tries to infer what the most likely number of states are, given that those states exist and they have some unique structure in brain and behavior. For the types of computational models I'm working with, I guess I would say that comes from just mechanisms themselves. So if you can infer the presence of a mechanism in some type of decision process, the way we do this is we design something like a switchboard model. So we think about all possible mechanisms being available to us that might, ultimately generate the behavior. And then we just try to infer through aggregating over model structures which mechanism is contributing the most to the model fit. So obviously that's very computationally intensive because you have to do every factorial arrangement of that. But if it can be separated in this way, then at least you can, put it on a cluster or something and let it run for the week and don't think about it too much.
I mean, that's what Carl was saying about Bayesian model comparison.
Yeah.
You have a bunch of models and you compare them. I mean, I guess what I'm asking is something slightly different, which is, you have a dynamic process. Let's imagine, think about what Hodgkin-Huxley did with an action potential, smooth action potential. They modeled it. They had a bunch of differential equations, and some of the details within their equations ended up being, hints about how individual ion channels work. So that was a macroscopic process, a smooth action potential that could be decomposed into individual ion channels and their cooperativity. So it ended up being, extremely useful for understanding the sort of microscopic building block of how something like that arises. And the question is, the analogy here, you have, these behavioral models that have latent variables that give you some idea of what the mental process is. What's the approach of trying to figure out the equivalent of what the underlying ion channels are? The brain circuits, the networks. How does it go beyond being, sort of, data fitting?
Yeah, of course. So the whole reason that I went down this road, right, was trying to understand how behavior arises. So you present a stimulus, and at some point, response time and a choice are collected. And there's anything could have happened between the beginning and the end of that trial. And so the hope was that, the brain gives us that, right? The hope is that, EEG or fMRI, we're going to have some sort of signature of these individual states. It must be, you have to sort of go through and to ultimately come up with the choice that you made. And so that's what we're trying to do here. But we don't have as much of a causal relationship. Like, for example, with DCM, you have that very specific, or I guess it's BDCM, I think they call it. You don't have that very expressed relationship of the stimulus going in, very specific dynamic happening in the brain, which ultimately produces a choice. So we don't have that. We're relying a lot on the computational models to kind of solve that problem for us. So unfortunately, we're missing this scale, I think, so right now. But yeah, we are building toward that more and more by now going down into the moment by moment dynamics. The hope is that we can extend that same moment by moment analysis even for a very short time range.
Great, thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Mike. And actually, we have a follow-up, a question that I think fits with this conversation from Hussein Ather, who's going to be asking about the dimensionality of the EEG and fMRI data. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, thank you. So as described in the chat box, just yes, and a bit related to this discussion, with high dimensional data, and this could be either with the mind, the brain or behavior, or all three. When you want to validate the models, when you want to validate the models on a very high dimension of the voxel itself, I was just wondering how you can account for explanations, or the parsimony of the explanations for which structure, which network structure would be the best to choose among such high level data. Specifically, what sort of constraints might need to be placed on the model, and how one might figure out which constraints would be best to use.
So yeah, this problem of reducing has been one that we've been looking at for a long time. So whenever you're fitting these Bayesian hierarchical models, right away let's start as a basis. You have to define ROIs, so a set of regions of interest, because we can't really do voxel level, because what we're talking about is actually fitting parameters to every single voxel and allowing that voxel dimensionality matriculate all the way up to the hyperstructure. And that's just too far. So what we've been doing is, applying this vector analytics strategy to kind of reduce the number of regions into one set, which you can imagine applying that also to voxels. So for example, if they were spatially or temporally correlated, they would tend to cluster within one factor structure because they have very similar expressions. They correlate with one another. So the hope is that, by moving more and more toward this approach of using factor analytic strategies, we'll be able to reduce it sort of on the fly. And then most recently, as I was mentioning in the talk, we tried this regularization approach to kind of really, squish ROIs, or in this case, voxels is the relevant medium at this point, to kind of squish them down to 0 if they don't contribute much to the fit, and boost the ones up a little bit, I guess, if they are contributing. So that's one approach for that. And when it comes to the Gaussian process modeling, one thing that I didn't get a chance to mention is we are doing some spatial temporal kernels in this. And so what we do is we take a spatial kernel and a temporal kernel, and we use a Kronecker product to basically fuse that information together in describing the latent dynamics. So that does work pretty well, and allows us to kind of say that one voxel relative to another, because they're so spatially close together, they're going to have some covariation. And similarly, voxels, if they are, linked together, but they're spread far apart, then you would expect that the covariation would be temporally lagged, right? Because it takes a while for that information to arrive at the other ROI or the other voxel, so on. So we have these spatial temporal kernels going into some of the analyses, and we were able to appropriately cover that. So we know it's at least feasible. But whenever we moved to real data, the whole brain was just a bit too much. We weren't able to do a full brain, with all these different ROIs and voxels. We just could not pull that off. So we're still working toward that, but we're hoping that technology, continues to improve. And so eventually these questions, we should be able to do it. But at least the theory stands, we should be able to do it.
All right. Thank you, Brandon. And thank you, Hussein, for that question. I don't see any more questions in the Q&A. Do we have anybody on the panel that wants to ask a follow-up question or introduce a new issue to Brandon? If not, I will kind of use my chair's prerogative to ask you a question somewhat unrelated to your talk, but related to your talk, and see if you'd be willing to speculate a little bit. So in reality, much of what you're calling behavior is actually a highly artificial and often prescribed kind of task, right? Some abstract of behavior to some extent. How will we actually be able to do this when we think about real behavior that unfolds over long periods of time, is very context dependent, may involve many different inputs and outputs happening simultaneously? I mean, how will we get at actually understanding this neural basis of extremely complicated behavior?
I wish I had an easy answer to that. Unfortunately, I don't.
I think we always do it an easy answer. No, go ahead, Brandon.
Well, so the best I can think of is, I'm really excited by this new GPJM style of modeling. The idea is that, we visit these states constantly, and we're just coming back to them every day. I mean, if I think about my day, it's very programmatic. It has a routine. I have to have coffee, and so on. And but I'm revisiting these different states, and you would think that if I don't visit those states, then it's going to affect how I make choices subsequently. It's going to have a very temporal structure and consequence for the rest of the day. And so the hope, I guess, is that by specifying some sort of embedding space and using these latent topological approaches, then maybe we'll have some more structure kind of emerge about this sort of global scale dynamic and how local decisions are really just a consequence of where you sit on this global topology. But that seems very incredibly difficult and required so much data, and I think fitting it would obviously be impractical at this point. But yeah, I look forward to the future, I guess.
Great, thank you. And John Griffiths, who's been working very hard in the background, helping me field questions from the chat and from the Q&A section, himself has a question. So I'd love to give John a chance to jump in here and ask some questions. Go ahead, John.
Thanks a lot, Susan. And by the way, thanks everyone for the excellent questions and the vibrant discussion. It's been a lot of fun to moderate. So yeah, Brandon, question, and it kind of takes it back a little bit to some of the things that Lisa was talking about. You mentioned, at a few points, your kind of factor analytic methodological strategies. But a lot of the things that you've been focusing on are kind of, somewhat kind of dynamic, real-time or kind of task-specific evaluations of kind of process type models for behavior and linking those to multivariate patterns in brain signals. The question is, I wonder if you have thought much about linking this to the other part of psychology, individual differences psychology, where there is this, somewhat rich body of theory about the quote structure of the mind, right? Like factor analytic decompositions of behavioral tasks. Like we know quite a lot about what they end up looking like. And I was wondering if, you could think about using those kind of decompositions as a, basis or a kind of starting point for building these more, dynamic and kind of brain-oriented models, and whether that could bring together, bridge the gap almost from kind of cognitive psychology to kind of factor analytic psychology.
Oh yeah, I think that's a great idea. I don't know exactly that we should expect different brain states to perfectly map on to these different psychological specifics. Like, I think you're talking about factor analytic strategy that just kind of reduce the number of personality dimensions. Is that kind of what you're leading toward or thinking?
No, more, like fluid intelligence, speed, processing speed, memory, decompositions of those things you get out of cognitive task battery.
Yeah, I see. So I guess you'd have to first, at least in the approach that we're using, you first have to map those types of concepts or constructs into some sort of cognitive model that would make a very specific prediction about how individual choices would be made. I think, for example, Susan's question is very related to this in the sense that, like, these are supposed to be, characteristics of that person that should go across global structure, right? And if we don't really have a way to map that yet, I'm not really sure how we can form that inference. So I think that there's significant theoretical overhead that would be first needed to be developed, in order to be able to make this fusion between a global structure and a local structure actually work out. So at least in the modeling that we've been doing, we're just kind of looking at trial to trial types of dependencies. But I agree with, both of you that there has to be something that helps constrain that, that comes from this global structure. It's just unfortunate that, the typical data sets that I have to deal with, or I get this person, for an hour or maybe, a week, at best. But so I don't really have access to some of this, global structure. But what you're suggesting, it sounds like, if we had some of these concepts that, we could measure outside of the scanner, for example, we had a sort of personalized inventory of this individual, then maybe we'd have a better understanding of what their brain should look like given that inventory. That seems feasible. I haven't really thought carefully about that, to be honest. Yeah, it seems reasonable that people who have different scores on these would have some very clear prediction about, what brain areas would be more strongly activated in general or in specific tasks. But yeah, that's the best I can do for that question.
That's a
right
great
now.
answer.
Thank
And
you.
I really like that you sum that up better than me with global structure versus local structure. So that kind of is a good summary.
Luckily, Susan led me on that path already. So.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for this getting us off of these two talks, and particularly this discussion, which I think has been really fascinating. Thank you, Brandon,